In the summer of 2020, a man walked into baseball immortality. The Baseball Writers Association of America tallied up 397 ballots. When the results came back, 396 of them had Derek Jeter's name on it. One voter, still anonymous to this day, left him off. Nobody knows why, and frankly, most people didn't care, because the outcome was never really in doubt. Derek Jeter was going to Cooperstown. That was settled the moment he retired. What wasn't settled, but still isn't settled, is how good he actually was. Because here's where it gets complicated. Jeter played 20 years in New York. He won 5 World Series titles, he had 3,465 hits, a 310 career average, and is probably the most recognizable baseball player of his generation. By almost any standard the casual fan uses, he's the greatest shortstop who ever lived. But then you pull up the advanced metrics, and what you find is a player who, by some of the most rigorous defensive analysis ever done, may have been the single worst fielding regular shortstop in the history of the position, while winning 5 gold gloves for it. So which version of Derek Jeter is true? That's what we're here to figure out. Not the legacy, not the pinstripes, not the aura, but the evidence. How good was Derek Jeter actually?
The shortstop position in the American League, you never know if you're going to get a chance to come to an All-Star game, let alone start one. So, I'm just thankful I got an opportunity to play.
To understand Derek Jeter, you first have to understand the era he played in, because where you play matters just as much as when you play. Jeter debuted in 1995 and became a full-time starter in 1996. That put him dead center in what historians now call the steroid era, the highest offensive environment in modern baseball history.
To McGuire, swinging a high fly ball, belted, and I mean belted deep to left field into the upper deck. My, oh my, what a shot by McGuire!
Here's what that means in concrete terms. In 1992, teams were averaging about 4.1 runs per game. By 1999 and 2000, that had climbed to over 5 runs per game. Home runs jumped roughly 50 to 60% across the same stretch. Now, PEDs get most of the blame for this, and PEDs were absolutely part of it. But analysts have consistently pointed to other factors too. Expansion diluting pitching talent in 1993 and 1998, smaller and more hitter-friendly ballparks being built, and a strike zone that was shrinking in practice, even if not on paper. The reason this matters is straightforward. Jeter's raw numbers have to be read inside this context. A 310 average in 1999 is not the same as a 310 average in 1968. The whole league was hitting. This is exactly why era-adjusted stats exist, and they'll be our primary lens when we get into the numbers. There's a second layer of context that's just as important. What was happening specifically at the shortstop position. For most of baseball history, shortstop was a defense-first position. You played it for your glove. Light hitting, rangy, maybe a little speed, that was the archetype. Then, in the late 1990s, something changed. You had Derek Jeter in New York, Alex Rodriguez in Seattle, then Texas, Nomar Garcia-Parra in Boston, 3 franchise-level offensive players, all shortstops, all arriving at basically the same time. The baseball world called them the Holy Trinity. They didn't just play the position well, they redefined what the position could be. Even within that elite group, Jeter had a specific profile. He wasn't the power hitter, A-Rod was. He wasn't the early career pure force Nomar was at his best. Jeter's game is more surgical, elite contact, elite on-base skills, durability, and an almost complete absence of slumps over a 20-year period. His profile actually looked more like the 1980s version of the great shortstops, Barry Larkin, Alan Trammell, than the slugging mold. And then there's the third piece of context, which is one that haunts the entire conversation about his defense. This was also the dawn of modern fielding analysis. The Fielding Bible, UZR, defensive runs saved. These systems were being built and refined in real time during Jeter's career. He became the first superstar whose defensive reputation ran directly into objective data, and the collision was not pretty. Let's start with offense, because that's where Jeter's case is the strongest, and it's substantially stronger than most people realize, even his defenders. Career slash line, 310 average, 377 on base percentage, 440 slugging percentage, 817 OPS over 20 seasons. That's not a number you manufacture with a hot month or two. That's consistency at an elite level for his entire career. Now take those numbers and run them through the error adjustments. His OPS plus, which compares him to the league average in each season and adjusts for park effects, was 115 for his career, meaning he was 15% better than the average hitter in his era, at a position where the average hitter was supposed to be below average. Fangraph's version of that adjustment, WRC plus, lands at 119. Slightly more generous, same story, a significantly above average offensive player, era adjusted. Now, for the number that might genuinely surprise you. Over the course of his career, Jeter accumulated 96.3 offensive WAR. That is, wins added by his bat and base running, separate from defense. That is the highest offensive WAR of any shortstop in the last century. The only shortstop in the history of baseball who is a better offensive player by this metric is Honus Wagner, who played when Woodrow Wilson was president. Think about what that means. Cal Ripken, Ozzie Smith, Ernie Banks, Alex Rodriguez, Barry Larkin. By offensive contribution, Jeter is ahead of all of them in the modern era. The counting stats underline it. 3,465 hits, 6th all-time in baseball history, and the most ever by a shortstop. 1,923 runs scored, 11th all-time. 544 doubles, 260 home runs, 358 stolen bases at a 78.7% success rate, and a career on-base percentage of 377, higher than Cal Ripken, higher than Ozzie Smith, higher than Alan Trammell, the highest OBP of any shortstop with at least 1,500 games since World War II. His peak was 1999, age 25. He hit 349 with a 153 OPS plus, meaning he was 53% better than the average hitter that year. He led the American League in WAR and hits and in win probability added, and he finished third in MVP voting. That's the offensive case. It's a genuinely great case. Now we have to talk about the other half. There's no polite way to present Derek Jeter's defensive numbers. They are, depending on which system you use, somewhere between bad and historically catastrophic. His career defensive WAR, per Baseball Reference, is negative 9.4. That's not 9.4 wins below average. That's 9.4 wins below the already adjusted replacement level baseline. It's the equivalent of his glove costing the Yankees nearly a full season of wins over his career. Defensive runs saved, which measures how many runs a fielder saves or costs compared to an average player at the position, gives him a career mark of negative 152 runs from 2003 to 2014, the window where the data is most reliable. One source of tracking an extended window puts that number at negative 162. UZR, a separate system built by a different researcher, has him at negative 66 runs. That's a huge gap between the two systems, roughly a factor of 2. We'll come back to that in a moment because it matters. And then there's the Baseball Prospectus's FRAA, fielding runs above average, which gives him a career total of negative 304. That's the worst mark in their entire historical database. Multiple independent systems, multiple researchers, different methodologies. They all point in the same direction. What was the actual problem? Specifically, it was range. His hands were fine, his error totals were actually below average, and he had a good arm. The issue is that balls other shortstops got to, he simply didn't reach. When Bill James, one of the founders of modern baseball analysis, watched film of Jeter and Adam Everett playing the same position, his conclusion was that the gap in range was real and visually obvious. In 2009, a Wharton statistician named Shane Jensen built his own independent fielding metric called SAFE. It rated Jeter the worst fielding shortstop in baseball. And yet, 5 gold gloves. 2004, 2005, 2006, 2009, 2010. Voted on by coaches and managers. This is where we need to pause and be fair, because the defensive story has a legitimate other side. The metrics are damning. but there are real reasons to treat them with some caution, particularly for the earlier years of his career. Before 2003, these systems relied on something called total zone, which reconstructs fielding data from play-by-play counts rather than from actual batted ball location data. The GPS level precision that StatCast gives us today didn't exist in 1996. Those early numbers carry some uncertainty. The gap between DRS and UZR, the factor of two difference, also tells you something. When two rigorous systems built by serious people disagree by that much on magnitude, it's a sign that the measuring range at shortstop is genuinely hard. Neither system is simply wrong, but neither is gospel either. There's also a minority analytical argument worth acknowledging. One study found that adjusting for the unusually high strikeout rates of Jeter's Yankees pitching staffs, which reduced the number of balls put in play and therefore reduces defensive opportunities, would shift his career dWAR from negative 9.4 all the way to roughly plus 3.7. That's a massive swing, and most analysts don't buy the full adjustment. But the underlying point, that context affects opportunity, and opportunity affects counting-based defensive metrics, is legitimate. And finally, the positional reality. Being a below-average defender at shortstop still means you're playing shortstop. You're standing at the hardest position on the field for 2 decades. The negative fielding numbers have to be understood relative to the premium position he held, not presented in a vacuum. The postseason is the part of Jeter's legacy that gets the most mythologized, so let's put the numbers on the table directly. Over 158 postseason games, that's essentially a full regular season's worth of baseball, Jeter hit .308 with a .374 on-base percentage and a .465 slugging percentage. His postseason OPS was .838. His postseason WRC+, 121. His regular season WRC+ was 119. He was the postseason hits leader. He was the postseason games leader. He was the postseason runs leader. He holds records across the board in playoff counting stats. But the analytical point that keeps getting lost in this conversation is important. His rate stats in October essentially matched his regular season production. He didn't dramatically elevate. What he did was refuse to decline, against better pitching on bigger stages, with everything on the line. Whether you think that's the same thing as clutch depends on your definition, but it's worth being clear about what the data shows and what it doesn't show. His postseason win probability added, a direct measure of how much his at-bats swung games, was .02 for his entire career. Not a dramatic positive, not a dramatic negative, essentially neutral. What he did have was volume. A Yankees team that made the postseason in 16 of his 20 seasons meant he accumulated more October at-bats than almost anyone who ever played, and he was reliably, consistently good in all of them. That's legitimately impressive, even if it isn't mystical. The flip play.
You gotta wait for a gapper.
That is fair down the right field line. Giambi on his way to third, and they're gonna wave him around. The throw misses a cutoff man, shot into the plate, out at the plate.
The dive into the stands against Boston.
1-2. He loops that to left field. Going to be a tough play. Jeter on the run, makes the play, and flies into the stands. Oh, what a play by Derek Jeter.
The walk-off home run at midnight on Halloween.
And these chimes mean it is November. He's taking care of the first two here in the 10th. Jeter hits it into right. Back at the wall. Game over. Yankees win and the series is tied. It is that time of year again. It is this city again. It is this team again. And on a cool November morning, Derek Jeter ends a long, thrilling night of baseball, and the Yankees have won Game 4, 4-3, and they've tied this World Series at 2 games apiece.
These plays are real, and they happened, and it would be dishonest to reduce them to noise, but they don't override what the full sample says either. So, how do you add all of this up? Career WAR, per Baseball Reference, 71.3 wins. Per Fangraphs, 73 wins. Both figures represent an outstanding career, the equivalent of approximately 7 above-average seasons, piled on top of a baseline of solid to good seasons, just by the math of how WAR accumulates. The difference between the two systems comes almost entirely from how they treat defense and replacement level. Fangraphs is somewhat kinder to him. Baseball Reference's dWAR calculation drags him down harder. Both are valid methodologies. Then there's JAWS, Jaff's metric that weighs both career WAR and peak WAR to evaluate Hall of Fame worthiness. By JAWS, Jeter ranks 13th all-time among shortstops, with a score of 56.8, just slightly above the average enshrined Hall of Fame shortstop at 55.5. By Fangraphs WAR, which treats his defense somewhat more generously, he ranks 6th among shortstops. So the system you choose matters, but neither system puts him outside the Hall, and neither puts him in the top 3. The strongest case for Derek Jeter is the one that doesn't require mythology. He is the greatest hitting shortstop of the past 100 years by offensive WAR. His career on-base percentage is the highest of any shortstop with 1,500 or more games since World War II. He produced elite offense at the most demanding infield position consistently for 2 decades against the backdrop of an era that inflated numbers for everyone, and the numbers still look excellent after adjustment. He had durability that almost no player at any position has matched. 16 seasons of 145 or more games. He hit .349 in his best year, .309 at age 38, and maintained an above-average bat through his mid-30s when most players are falling off the table. The decline curve at the very end of his career was real, but it also compressed into the final year or two. His postseason record, when you separate volume from rate, shows a player who is reliably excellent against tougher competition. That's a genuine accomplishment, even if it's not the supernatural clutch narrative. And the defensive picture, while bad, has legitimate uncertainty baked into it, especially for the early career years where the data reconstruction is imperfect. The most generous reading of his defense, with the pitching staff adjustment, gets him into positive territory. Most analysts don't accept that fully, but the honest version of the defensive analysis includes the caveats alongside the numbers. The case against is not that Jeter was bad. The case against is specifically that he is consistently evaluated as something greater than he was, and that the gap between perception and evidence is unusually large, even for a superstar. He never won an MVP award. He finished as high second in 2006. In his best statistical season in 1999, he finished third in voting despite leading the American League in WAR. There were players who were measurably better than him in multiple seasons, and the awards didn't reflect that because the halo around the Yankees and the Derek Jeter brand was enormous. By JAWS, the most widely used Hall of Fame evaluation tool, he is an average Hall of Famer at his position. Not the greatest shortstop ever, not top 5 all time, an average Hall of Fame shortstop who ranks behind Honus Wagner, Alex Rodriguez, Cal Ripken, Archie Vaughan, and George Davis, among others. The Gold Gloves were arguably a miscarriage of award process. 5 of them voted on while objective systems were recording some of the worst range numbers in the history of the position. Bill James wrote that Jeter had a halo effect, and he put it bluntly. Any area of performance that was poorly documented or poorly understood, the media would use to polish Jeter's trophies. Defense was poorly understood, so he got the Gold Gloves. And the Captain Clutch narrative, when you run it against the postseason WRC+, 121 to his regular season 119, is essentially a story about consistency rather than elevation. His postseason win probability added was .02 for his career. The mystique was real, but the statistical elevation wasn't. When you survey how the analytical community, the mainstream baseball world, and Jeter's peers have evaluated him, a clear picture emerges, and it's a split one. The Hall of Fame vote was 99.7%. Only Mariano Rivera, Jeter's own teammate, has ever been elected more unanimously. That number reflects the consensus of hundreds of baseball writers who watch him for 20 years. It is also, at least partly, a product of the New York market, the dynasty context, and 2 decades of dominant positive coverage. By JAWS, the analytical community's best tool for placing Hall of Famers, he's 13th among shortstops and essentially at the average of enshrined players at the position. That's a clear Hall of Famer. It's not a legend tier Hall of Famer. ESPN's Jeff Passan, one of the best baseball writers of his generation, looked at this debate from both sides and landed on what might be the most honest verdict available. Jeter's overrated by people who call him the greatest shortstop ever, and underrated by analysts who reduce him entirely to his fielding metrics. He's properly rated as one of the best shortstops and best Yankees ever. A combination of consistency and longevity that is rare and genuinely valuable. Jay Jaffe, the creator of JAWS, put him comfortably in the Hall, but outside the elite tier. Fangraph's broader body of work on Jeter consistently affirms the offensive greatness while flagging the defensive drag. His peers, particularly in the postseason context, clearly respected him. Managers put him in the 3-hole on October rosters. Opponents game planned around him. The reverence within the game was genuine. Where the split becomes sharpest is on the defensive gold gloves and the all-time shortstop ranking. The analytical community is essentially unanimous that the gold gloves were wrong. The public and the legacy press largely don't care. And on the all-time ranking, JAWS says 13th. oWAR says 2nd ever. And somewhere in that gap lives the real answer. Derek Jeter was one of the greatest offensive shortstops in the history of baseball. That is not a narrative. That is what the numbers say. Era adjusted, position adjusted, and reviewed through every lens we have. He was also a poor defender. Multiple independent systems with different methodologies all confirm it. The magnitude is debated, but the direction is not. His all-in career value, when you combine the elite bat with the subpar glove, puts him roughly at the average of Hall of Fame shortstops by the best metric we have for that comparison. He was comfortably good enough to be in Cooperstown. He was not the greatest shortstop who ever played, or even close to it. The Captain Clutch label contains truth and mythology in roughly equal measure. He was an elite hitter who stayed elite in October against better competition. He didn't measurably elevate beyond his already excellent baseline. For most players, being that good in the postseason would be the story. For Jeter, because the expectation was superhuman, merely being great reads as a disappointment to the legend. So how good was Derek Jeter actually? He was the best hitting shortstop of the past 100 years. He was a below-average defender at the position he played. He was the first-ballot Hall of Famer who ranked somewhere between 6th and 13th all-time at his position, depending on how much weight you give to what his glove cost his teams. He was not the greatest shortstop who ever lived. He was something more interesting than that. A player who, in a position historically defined by what you did with your glove, quietly became the most productive offensive player the position had seen in a century, and somehow convinced an entire generation of fans, writers, and award voters that the glove was fine too. That's not a diminishment. That might actually be the most impressive thing about him.
In base, and there's no one on base, so I was all messed up, but I want to thank everyone here. I've said it time and time again. Thank you, Derek, and I'm thinking to myself, for what? You know, I'm just trying to do my job, so thank you guys.